Hope some of you are tuning in from outdoors so you can soak in some vitamin D while tuning into this webinar. I'm Pearl Lau, External Affairs Director at Vulcan, and I've been part of the Seattle for Everyone Coalition since its early days. And much has changed in our city since Seattle for Everyone formed in support of the housing affordability and livability agenda, HALA. And we want to thank everyone who has come out to all of the neighborhood hearings and city council meetings in support of MHA and other pro-housing efforts. Without that, the housing conversation in Seattle just wouldn't be where it is today. And even before the COVID-19 pandemic began to unfold in February and March, we knew that there was a lot of hard shared work to do in our city to plan for growth in a way that improves everybody's quality of life and to expand housing choice for people of all incomes and backgrounds. And while there's still much to be written in the story of housing and the pandemic, there are some things that we at Seattle for Everyone Coalition can affirm now. First is that the intensity and scale of the crisis has increased since COVID-19. The solutions should and must be big, bolder, and bigger. In this moment in time, we have an opportunity for transformative, positive change. In the same way that discussing zoning changes would be nearly impossible in Seattle politics before 2014, many things are being discussed now which would have been off limits before. And so we must seize this opportunity to avoid the repeat of 2007 and 2008 crash where community wealth evaporated and inequality increased. The solutions must be regional and holistic. That's the second thing. For solutions to be truly transformative, we must take a regional and even national approach to housing. Resources and coordination that are needed to meet this challenge are bigger than one city. That's one of the big things we learned. And that solutions in the housing ecosystem must also carefully consider unintended consequences. We believe that whatever the solutions may be, that more housing is an important component. We can only make bold, holistic changes together across silos, creatively, thoughtfully, and with persistence. Seattle for Everyone is an unlikely coalition of groups that have, at certain times, been on opposite sides of issues: labor and business, nonprofit developers and private housing developers, organizations, and individual neighbors, for instance. But we need the voices and insights from all to grasp the immensity of the problem we face and to craft durable solutions that can correct past mistakes in housing underproduction, land use, and urban planning. So that brings me to this webinar is part of what will be our larger efforts to engage and organize the Seattle and King County community. We want to hear from you and to provide opportunities for your voice to be part of our efforts. Please look for future webinars, Seattle for Everyone neighborhood meetings and advocacy actions to spring up. And when it's safe, we would love to start in-person events. Now, let's get to meet our speakers. We get to learn from a great set of speakers today, all with their own insights and perspectives to share with us from different but intrinsically related fields. We have Claudia Balducci, King County Council Chair and the co-chair of the Regional Affordable Housing Task Force. We also have Morgan Shook, a Senior Policy Advisor and expert in land use and redevelopment policy, planning, and finance at ECONorthwest. And Kristin Ryan, a partner at Barrientos Ryan with vast experience in complex multifamily and civic project development. She has also advised nonprofits and governmental agencies seeking to use multi-layered financing approaches for projects. So with that, I'll hand it off to our speakers.
All right, so thank you, Pearl. I think I'm up first here, and I want to just kind of step back a little bit and hopefully do some table setting for our two other panelists here to dive into some of the policy and sort of technical issues around trying to meet our housing needs and obviously accomplish the larger social goals that are sort of embedded with housing and where it sits for all of us. So, so let me talk a little bit about where I think we are, right? And so we spent the better part of the last decade deeply focused on issues of housing affordability, affordability problems that were primarily driven by really strong demand and a supply system that couldn't keep pace, much less for folks who are paying kind of more quote unquote market prices, or individuals whose incomes are on the lower end of the scheme and needed more governmental support. So I think generally that issue will continue to be here. Obviously the dynamics around the economic fallout related to the stay-at-home orders to sort of stem the tide of coronavirus are driving a lot of sort of the housing and housing affordability issues. And so we'll have to pay deep attention to that. But we also need to make sure we understand the role that construction and in building housing, whether we're talking sort of more market rate or private backed development, or even development that is driven by a lot of our government supports, whether they be through low-income housing tax credits or through the Washington State Housing Finance Trust Fund and the bond issues to sort of support more sort of income and rent controlled housing. So obviously the way we've been looking at this, right, is there's kind of going to be three phases to that sort of double-edged issue. The issues of shutdown obviously started in March and are maybe continuing in sort of this sort of move to reopening. And we're likely to be in this sort of phase, right, probably for the foreseeable 12 to 18 months. And then the question here is how do we then set ourselves up, right, to sort of move through reopening and then through recovery? Because I think something we learned here and a sort of framework that is sort of really useful when we think about housing is that there is really a virtuous sort of circle here. And obviously we're trying to meet the demands of a more diverse, both social, both economic, demographic, and sort of age-wise population as we grow into the future. But then we realize by providing that housing, we provide a lot of other things we care about. That investment is particularly in construction, is heavily reliant on labor, both in the skilled and unskilled trades. And a lot of that investment flows directly to wages because it is sort of such a labor-intensive activity. And so that is sort of a great piece of that. Both that investment and that labor circulates, and it generates a lot of either direct taxes or sort of indirect taxes from folks spending their paycheck. And that helps support government receipts that go out and do that reinvestment, to invest in sort of public health, to invest in public safety, to invest in sort of affordable housing. So if we can kind of keep the sort of dual goals of making sure we keep our eye on making that we provide sort of stable housing, both for today's population and for going forward, we can also then keep the economic engine that supports jobs and economic opportunity, as well as sort of the public services that underlie that. So just to give you a sort of a quick snapshot of that. So when we take a look at actually 2018 in the city of Seattle and just look at sort of a broad metric of the amount of investment we had, and this is sort of both sort of multifamily and commercial, but roughly that was about $8 billion in direct construction investment, translated to basically supporting 28,000 direct jobs over that year, and an additional sort of 45,000 jobs statewide, you know, for folks in sort of the supply chain, professional services, architecture, engineering trades. Of that 8 billion, more than half of that flows directly to sort of labor to workers, and then roughly equates to about $100 million in incremental city tax revenues just on the investments in construction. And obviously with the shutdown, that picture is been disrupted and obviously is unclear about what that might look like over the next 6 months, over the next 60 weeks, over the next 6 years perhaps. And so we're all trying to pay attention to that. But particularly, right, that effect was pretty darn pronounced in the construction sector. And but luckily it's kind of stabilized out, at least in the short run here, as people are back into projects. But that sort of next wave of projects is a bit uncertain. To what extent are those permitted projects able to accelerate and get on the ground and put people back to work? And so just to take a look at this, we say, well, what happened over our last big sort of economic shock during the Great Recession? And so what we see here, right, is there is a big lag between sort of what happens in the broader economy versus what's happening in the construction industry. And that's really sort of a proxy for the investment in buildings and residential. We see a big lag. So roughly it took about 64 months for all other jobs to recover to sort of the pre-recession high. And then it took almost double that time for the construction sector and to sort of get on track. And obviously, Kristin will talk a little bit about some of the issues around why we see that, given sort of the long lead times it takes to kind of get a project conceived and built. So the question here is, both for housing future production and for all those benefits, is what trajectory are we going to be on? And obviously a lot of this is contingent on what happens with the spread of the virus and our ability to sort of stem it and hopefully have vaccinations, because without sort of workers feeling safe, the economy is not going to be able to recover. But the thing I think policy makers and other folks need to keep in mind is there are choices at the margin, right, that can help speed that curve along. We would all like a sort of V-shaped and sort of fairly steep recovery, but we maybe be headed for this kind of square root or Nike swoosh recovery. But the question here for all of us is to say, what can we do here that gets us more figured on getting housing projects up and going? And this is just a quick chart here, just showing sort of how the quirkiness of Washington State tax code here really helps drive government receipts. So this is the incremental taxes that are generated just by construction activity in the city of Seattle. So roughly $100 million in 2018. And a lot of that is due because of the retail sales tax applying to construction activity. It has to do with property taxes that are allowed to grow past the 1% limit because of the new construction add-on, but also the fact that a lot of the activity is then taxed at the business level at the B&O taxes, as well as sort of other sort of district-based taxes like the Transportation Benefit District. So let me turn my remarks here a little bit to kind of what's happening with affordability. And so we saw the big run up in, and I think almost all of us felt this in one way or the other, in housing affordability. A lot of this issue had to do with a lot of new construction coming on, which sort of tilted it up. But at the same time, there were sort of real deep sort of scarcity that drove even older buildings that would, we typically think of as sort of naturally occurring affordable housing up. But obviously, we're a little bit past that peak. And because we have a lot of new supply coming on, maybe the economy is slowing a little bit, but it doesn't mean that our affordable challenge is over. And I would say, obviously, I've talked a little bit about just the short-term issues around the economic impact that many folks are being felt having lost jobs and such. But I think the thing we shouldn't lose track of is a lot of that run up we saw in 2009 to 2017, that is really decades in the making. And more of a fact that we weren't producing housing at rates that we had typically done that would put things in equilibrium, and particularly in equilibrium that would be at levels that would make housing affordable for folks making sort of moderate and lower incomes. And so we have this conception, and this is some work we've done for a great a nonprofit, Up for Growth, that's really focused in on sort of smart growth, intense growth policies meant to sort of grow housing around transit. And one of the things we see here is what happens when basically the rate of housing starts to fall back from the rate of household formation. So two things happen. One is whatever slack that is in the system in terms of vacancy or occupancy gets gets eaten up pretty quickly. And then we start seeing scarcities, and that scarcity starts the sort of musical chairs of affordable housing challenges. And people with the lowest incomes are the ones that can be the first ones not to be able to find the seat. And the big issue there is also they also disproportionately sort of impacts people of color. And so we want to make sure that as we think about this, that we're going forward, it's not just that we need to solve the short-term thing, but we need to keep an eye on the long-term issue. And if you look at sort of just King County over the last 10 years, our math here works out that we're roughly down about 180,000 units, that if we would have just kept pace with the decade before around housing unit formation, we would have had that number. So the other interesting thing that's happening here is, even though we built a lot of housing, but the nature of the housing we're building is just categorically different. So what you see here is the number of units by units within a structure. And during the 40s through the 70s, right, we were building lots of different kinds of units, a good mix of stuff, particularly in sort of what we call right now missing middle housing, right? But if you look at what's happened in the sort of 20 to 30 years since, is particularly, this is data for King County and Pierce County combined, is we're almost exclusively, about 75% of all units are being constructed as part of large projects. And there's lots of different reasons for that. Part of it is economics, but a large part of that is land use policy, and policy that we see up and down the Central Puget Sound that really kind of divides housing into kind of two sort of polar camps, right? One, and folks probably not too unfamiliar with this, but right, folks that live in sort of fairly low density sort of housing arrangements, and then efforts to really then concentrate housing in centers and other places, which is still a great idea, but it also then ignores a central part of policy. Could we fill in that gap? And so a lot of the effort, I think, in current thinking is to say, well, could we provide ways to think about a range of densities that are organized around our transportation system to provide accessibility to both obviously jobs and services, but also provide accessibility to more housing types and hopefully more affordability. It has two purposes. Obviously, it allows the marketplace to work hopefully more efficiently and serve more people, but it also then helps us obviously generate taxes, but also helps those taxes, particularly if they're invested in affordable housing, go a little further. One of the sneaky things that actually happens when we have a lot of scarcity, particularly on the land side, is it takes that dollar that we raise for affordable housing investment just doesn't go as far as we would like, because there are big costs in terms of acquiring land. There are big costs of having to do higher intensity type of development, and those are big challenges. So with that, hopefully I kind of provided some good perspective and overview, and I'll turn it over to Kristin to talk a little bit about this at the project level.
All right. Can everybody hear me now? Excellent.
Yeah.
Oh, and you can see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So just making sure our transitions work. So I am a developer. You're going to hear me echo many of the things that Morgan's just put forth in relation to how many of these economic factors come into play in the actual delivery of units. But that is what I do every day. I work to deliver housing units. I've focused much of my work on trying to develop opportunities for housing across the economic spectrum. And so I'm going to speak to you about a couple things. Who do we need to build housing for to help support the recovery? What does it take to actually deliver these units? Where and when do we need them? And why does housing matter so much for recovery? Many of these things, again, echoing some of the points Morgan's just made. So why do we build for and who do we build for? We really need to build for everyone. As we've noted, there's a housing crisis prior to the COVID crisis, and that crisis hasn't gone away. And as our region's residents are facing more economic stress, the need for more supply of affordable housing only increases. And as Morgan noted, this disproportionately highlights communities of color, and we need to be very intentional and cognizant of our work as we continue to make sure there are opportunities. Social determinants of health are a set of parameters that outline how social and physical environments provide health for all. We very clearly right now understand and know how public health and health impacts our economy overall. And one of the fundamental principles for the framework that Healthy People 2020 puts out is that housing instability is one of the underlying factors of economic stability. So we really always need to keep in mind how the inability to provide housing across the spectrum will always impact our economic stability as a city and a region. We need to think about how we are providing this access, and with the widened income inequality gap that we'd seen prior to the crisis, the COVID crisis, and knowing that will continue to increase, we really have to think about how we're making sure always that we can provide support at all levels. I'll speak a little later about how to look at that from the economic and the capital stack standpoint, but it is clear from these images and the faces of the folks in the slide, right? There are lots of roles necessary and critical to provide for a thriving city and a thriving region. And we can't have access to make sure that folks across the spectrum have opportunities to live near the work that we need everyone to do, that we won't have a thriving city. Housing delivery is multifaceted. So it takes a lot of different things, and each of those elements have different ways that they're impacted. And because it's so multifaceted, one of those elements may move in one direction at the same time as a different element is moving in a different direction. So land prices can go down in the crisis, but that didn't mean that construction prices automatically have also gone down, because construction costs may have gone up. Our time to that it takes to deliver construction is going up as we introduce PP&E, and we need less folks on job sites at the same time. So when we look at each of these individual factors, we can't just sort of say, oh, housing just moves as one big unilateral shift. It really moves in kind of lumpy, it's a series of little lumpy activities that push it in directions, but it's a huge piece of why it takes a long time to move. It is not, it moves slowly in relation to the immediacy of some of those impacts. So land, we aren't yet seeing distressed sellers, and we don't know whether we will immediately or what the time frame for that to be. Permitting has been sort of thrown up on its head as a lot of our work gets done with public input, and entities and agencies are trying to figure out how to do that virtually right now. The uncertainty in the marketplace puts challenges to access of private capital, and it goes without saying that there are incredible strains on public capital right now and the access to subsidy sources with budget shortfalls and the challenges that all of our government entities are working through. And that also comes through in the real estate world in the ways that we look at trying to help support affordable and moderate income housing with waivers of taxes or utility fees or permit fees, which are all revenue streams that our cities are, stretched to have access to on an ongoing basis as we face the COVID crisis. And as we go forward, looking forward, underwriting that happens today is premised on what's going to happen with vacancy rates, rental rates looking forward, what's happening to operating costs going forward. And I don't think we have clear pictures of those yet. And so that creates uncertainty in the development that wants to come to the table right at this moment. So this time to implement is long. Right? The work, if we had a crisis before and if we don't maintain production now, we're just going to exacerbate the problem. This is really that equilibrium that Morgan spoke to, and some of these following slides I have will show. But there have been articles over the last couple of years about increasing permitting timelines, which is sort of the opposite outcome of what we need in these moments when we are in a crisis. And permitting doesn't even start until after a site's identified. So developers need, and owners go find sites, and then they do feasibility to make sure it is going to be a viable project, and they put pro formas together, and then they get design together to start into permitting. So when permitting takes 1 to 2 years, depending on project and project size, and construction takes another year to 2.5 years, we're looking at a minimum of 2 to 5 years for delivery of units that we think about today. And so these actions don't take effect to as early as 2022 and 2025. And so if we want to avoid what happened in the last recession, where that dramatic undersupply caused impacts to what we are seeing today, we have to be cognizant of continuing to deliver supply now. These are some factors of, again, what that supply and demand disconnect. So this is fundamental to what Morgan spoke about. And with housing stability, fundamental to economic stability, if we know that we're continuing to see population growth, and many of our local firms are still growing. So while many people are unemployed, other firms are still drawing in new bodies, and new residents will need places to live. And so if we don't continue to supply homes, we will continue to have our affordability crisis and our crisis overall. While these charts in front of you here actually use permitting activity as a proxy for unit delivery, the circle in the chart on the right really shows what Morgan was alluding to in this huge sort of drop of production that occurred after the last economic recession. And so where we were delivering more units on a regular basis in the decade before that, that substantial drop really caused a problem when we had such an increased growth in demand due to our huge exponential growth in the city in the region in the last several years. That meant we're still trying to actually catch up from the undersupply in those years. And that's the cycle piece that we really can't afford to have occur again without a massive challenge on our hands. These two charts too, as you'll see, don't distinguish between market rate and affordable housing. They're showing sales activity on the left and rental activity on the right. And we need all types of units in all places. I think one of the things that we forget sometimes is how delivery of more market units really does help satisfy price pressure that occurs on the units below. So folks that have the opportunity, have enough economic wherewithal to rent a unit can always rent below. And so if there are not enough market rate units available, that those renters push into renting units, or buyers push into buying units at a lower price point that they still can certainly afford, but that means the stock isn't available for the whole cadre of residents for whom that's their eligible price point. And the other thing to think about is that I know right now with COVID, it's sort of hard to be thinking about higher density and lots of use of transit, and transit-oriented development, TOD, is certainly economically more beneficial for families who are struggling because it can lower the total cost of living. But we need units everywhere. We need them in the backyards of single-family homes. We need low-rise multifamily in the neighborhoods that have access to needs and services and schools. And so we really need to be thinking about how this works across the board. I do most of my work in Seattle, but this holds true in different levels of density, obviously, as we think about across our region. But density in those contexts is relevant, and it's just making sure that we are looking at a lot of different ways that we can provide that activity. So what else can we do, right? Being creative in the units that we deliver across the spectrum, as I said, co-housing or ADUs. We can deliver units without parking, and they don't only have to be affordable units. We've allowed that in affordable work, but it's been more challenging across some permitting places to do it without. We can have high rises that are affordable. There are lots of different ways that we need to keep innovating, and we need to encourage our regulatory bodies to support that innovation without sort of overanalyzing the risks or the public response to those new typologies. The market will respond, right? If a certain type of unit has demand and can help match this equilibrium of supply and demand, we will see lots of them then get delivered if it's economically efficient to do so. And if it is something that just doesn't work for people, it's not going to work, and then we need to move on to the next option. We obviously need to be faster to delivery and speed it up. We need to figure out the role of public input in our permitting process, and we've already had to look, because of the modifications that have been made with the crisis, about the opportunities to gain that same input. We've started to make those tweaks, and it's a time to take that shift and understand that we can move forward with it. we can leave public input for public buildings and public spaces, right? Not every single building just because we happen to experience it in our public realm. I mean, I laugh and think I'm spending a lot more time these days right now looking at delivery vehicles and the Amazon packaging that shows up on my front porch, and not necessarily the other buildings around my neighborhood, because we are sheltering in place. But we don't have public input on what the UPS truck looks like, and we don't have public input on what the Amazon package looks like. And so we need to be thoughtful about that in terms of the high need for housing and how not let it get logged up into the process that is part of our current sort of public access. Next, we need to make it make sense for private investment. So, right, there are three ways really to access capital: taxes, donations, and investment, if you're thinking about it on an individual basis. And I think we need to let subsidy and philanthropy used where there isn't a market model. In the lowest of low-income units and in affordable tax credit units, there is not a market investment model outside of the return from the tax credits that allows that to make sense. The cost of the investment is too high to provide a return at the rents that we want to charge to ensure that that's affordable to our lower income populations. And so looking at investment, there need to be ways in anything that might be able to provide a return to really think about how are the ways that we can encourage that more. Now, at the end of the day, right, development companies are just that, they're companies. Developers often get a pretty bad rap for trying to make money, but developers across the spectrum have different profit and return thresholds for their partners and shareholders, if they're a public company, if they're not. So there are a lot of factors that go into why a developer is trying to make or needs to make the return that they do and have their product pencil the way that it needs to. And that just is, so when we've seen this, there's been a lot of conversation about the developers doing only these really expensive units. But we've had a very high cost of development. We've had high land costs with this growth. We've had high construction costs. And certain developers need high enough returns to garner the rents from those. And that's the business model. The business model is such that those returns are, those high rents and high price points are necessary to garner those returns. And we have other, this is not unique to development. You can, Michael Kors or Alexander McQueen or other fashion designers sell jeans for $1,000 and you can buy them at Uniqlo for $15. So we have this, striation of price points across our industries. But the key with the housing is remembering, right, people with more money can choose to spend less, but it doesn't work the other way around. And so if we also don't have enough market housing, high-income renters can much more easily take up the less expensive units than low-income renters can find housing that they can afford to live in. So we have to find ways to make sense for investors across the spectrum to invest in different ways and use private investment in moderate income housing and not just market housing, which is sort of our typical way of going. And we've seen this happen more recently. We've seen several groups come to support this sort of social impact investment that's combining potentially a non-market economic return, but providing the social good of providing more housing, often from groups that understand that the long-term impact of providing that housing has much larger purpose economic benefit. We've seen private companies, so some ways that this is being used are things like the Community Investment Guarantee Pool, where foundation endowment, investment, company endowment, company sort of balance sheet investments provide backstops to help mitigate risk to investors and help leverage other investment into those projects. There are several corporate groups and private groups aggregating funds recently that we've talked that are taking lower return thresholds in order to invest money into projects that are just targeting a moderate income renter. And we can certainly talk more about those models in the Q&A or contact me. This is a lot of the work that I've been focused on trying to do. And last, we need to be inclusive, right? Developers build buildings and good ones are building good spaces within the communities they exist in, but the community is really created by the people that are in them. And we need to remember that we keep our space welcoming for all. And so if we aren't allowing buildings to be built in certain neighborhoods or certain areas because we feel like those aren't the people that we want in our communities, we need to think twice. We need to remember to be inclusive and remember that we need housing as much as we can get it, everywhere we can get it right now if we aren't going to continue this crisis. So I leave you with a quote from Rush Chetty's organization, Opportunity Insights, is a group that really focuses on the role of place in the sort of opportunity that folks have, and how where people live and where they grow up influences their opportunities through the rest of life. And so the question's not whether we can have high levels of upward mobility in America today, rather we simply need to understand how to replicate the high rates of mobility we see in some of our neighborhoods to all communities. We have a great place here in this region with a lot of assets, and we don't want our region to become have and have nots. And so that socioeconomic diversity is really critical, and housing stock is really quite literally the building block of who can live here and share in those benefits. And so we need to make sure it's available for everyone. With that, I'm pleased to hand it over to Councilmember Balducci.
Thank you, Kristin. It's really great to hear the presentations. Can I ask, I'm sorry, I cannot actually figure out a way to have more than one screen up at the same time, which I need to do. So can somebody on the other end please project the slides for me?
I'll do that for you.
Yeah, thanks, Brady. Sorry. All right. Slide one is just a picture of myself, so I'm going to start talking because you can see me. Hi, welcome everybody. Good to be with you. My name's Claudia Balducci. I'm a King County Council member. I'm the chair of the council this year, and I represent the east side of Lake Washington. I want to start by saying I still find it a little interesting to be invited to groups like this because I've spent most of my elected years working on transportation, and I still consider myself more of a transportation person than a housing person. In my early years as a Bellevue council member and then later as mayor, I worked a lot for many years on improving our transit system. Transportation was always identified as the top 1 or 2 items that my constituents cared about. And we spent a lot of time focusing on building out light rail, but you can't really work on transportation for too long without coming to the conclusion that our transportation problems are really housing problems, with the whole idea of drive through till you qualify, and the fact that people just simply can't afford to live near where our big job centers, especially here on the east side, unless they're making very high wages. As time went on for me, I also started to see in our numbers around housing costs, wages, educational levels, any level of demographic data you look at, that Bellevue and my current district, which includes parts of Kirkland, Redmond, Woodinville, the Points communities, a little piece of Bothell, all of Mercer Island, is rapidly transforming from an expensive part of the county to being an exclusive part of the county, where really people struggle to be able to afford to live anywhere near here. And as that change has evolved, so has the thinking of our constituents. What used to be the number 1 and 2 concerns of my constituents were always transportation and public safety, and they would flop back and forth in spots 1 or 2. But public safety has long since dropped off the list, and now housing affordability is typically the number 1 concern for people in my district. As Kristin and Morgan outlined, our region's housing crisis has really been exacerbated by the pandemic. We have developed a short-term housing emergency on top of a long-term housing crisis. It's also put a tremendous spotlight on the racial inequality in our society and in our housing market. I'm going to talk about this quite a bit in the presentation. By every measure, if you are a Black, Indigenous, person of color, you are way more likely to be swept up in the affordability crisis. And that has only become more true with the pandemic. And it just really has to become a key focus of all of our work. Slide 2, please. I don't know if you can see the second slide, but it is about the Regional Affordable Housing Task Force. So I was introduced as the co-chair of the Regional Affordable Housing Task Force. This was a task force we formed between King County and many of our cities in 2017. We recognized the regional nature of the housing crisis, and I worked with the mayor of Kenmore, David Baker, to convene this task force. It was government focused, and the questions we were asking ourselves was to learn more of the contours of the housing problem and to explore government solutions. What were the things that we should be doing in local and regional government to try to address the problem? This slide just sort of shows the effort, and it's not intended to be read. But we had a number of meetings. We had our tasks laid out for us. If you could progress to slide 3. I'm not sure if we're getting the slides. Can you all see this? I feel like we're still on slide 1.
Hey, Claudia, I don't know if we've lost Brady, but let me see if I can quickly grab the slides. Hold on.
Sorry. Thank you all for helping.
Oops.
Ah, there we go. Okay. Maybe if you switch to display mode on, then we'll see it bigger. There we go. So one of the things that we found, one of our key takeaways that we found in the task force was that well over 100,000 families, households in King County, and at the time, 2017, were severely cost burdened, which you all probably are aware means that they pay more than half of their income for housing. And that's just not a sustainable place to be. It's one missed paycheck, one car repair, one illness, one unanticipated big bill away from potentially losing your home. And the severe cost burden was not spread evenly. This data is a little bit older, but in 2015, if you were an Alaska Native or American Indian household, there was a 30% chance that you were severely cost burdened. If you're in a Black household in King County, there was a 27% chance that you were severely cost burdened. And by comparison, if you were in a white household, there was a 13% chance that you were severely cost burdened. Moving on. And we don't have updated cost burden data that reflects the impact of the pandemic yet, but based on what we know about employment trends and impacts on sectors of employment, it is very, you can infer that the racial disproportionality in cost burden is probably just increasing right now. King County residents filed more than 400,000 new unemployment claims between March 1 and June 20th, which puts our rate at about 14% unemployment as compared to 2.3% in February. The industries that were hit the earliest and the hardest are shown here, and they're expected to recover the most slowly. And we know that these industries also include predominantly low-wage jobs where people of color are overrepresented. Food and beverage services, clothing and retail stores, support and accommodation services have lost the most jobs nationally and likely locally. Slide 5, please. Likewise, we've seen some of the results of our rental assistance efforts. We've seen, in addition to the moratorium that the governor has placed on evictions, there's also been a major attempt to try to help people keep up with their rent. The need just totally outstrips our ability to support folks. But as we saw in the United Ways program, which distributed $5 million in rental assistance in the month of April, the need was so great that the agency had to close down its application process in just 3 days. And even shutting it down so quickly, they were only able to provide grants to 1 out of 3 applicants. And tellingly, the locations where most of the applications came from were some of the poorest and most diverse locations within King County. And of those who applied, 72% were people of color. This is an area of a great deal of concern at all levels of government right now, because if and when the governor's eviction moratorium expires, we're going to have a wave of families who have back rent that they owe and who will be at risk of eviction. Next slide, please. Back on the Affordable Housing Task Force, in addition to looking at the immediate need, which was worsening, the task force looked into the future, and we took a 20-year time frame to try to identify how many new or preserved affordable units would be needed to ensure that no one earning less than 80% of area median income would be cost burdened. I define this as a healthy housing market. If you had everyone who was cost burdened was able to find a home within their wage range, we estimated that we would need 244,000 new or preserved affordable units by 2040. And again, this was in 2017. The task force broke this need into a 5-year target, and which would be 44,000 affordable units before the year of 2024. And that number was pretty startling to us, that 244,000 number, because although the housing market was booming at that time with new construction all over, we still weren't catching up. What's clear from our work at the task force and others, there have been others who've looked at this as well, we're serving the top of the market. At one point you could have said that we were serving some portions of the middle of the market. I don't know that you could say that anymore, but we're not serving the bottom of the market. Next slide, please. Outside of the task force, the consulting firm McKinsey & Company has been analyzing our housing market to determine how well it is serving low-income people, and they also determined that it isn't. They found that in the last 10 years, King County has lost more than 112,000 units of affordable housing that is affordable to 80% AMI and below. So we're going in the wrong direction. We need a tremendous upgrowth in housing. And in fact, when we look at it, we seem to be going in the other direction, losing affordable housing. This is what some define as the hole in the bucket. We can pour in all the water, but if it's coming out the bottom, we're not making progress. When looking at the need for people living at 0 to 30% AMI, and these are the folks most at risk of homelessness, McKinsey found that we needed 37,000 new units. They estimate that this would cost at least $4.5 billion to meet that need over the next 10 years. Next slide, please. And if we were looking for a silver lining in the COVID years, that the recession that has ensued in our response to COVID might help bring down the cost of housing. Historically, recessions don't bring down the cost of housing. In fact, our studies have shown that the cost of housing rises during a recession, with the significant exception being the Great Recession of 2008 to 2010. But as we all know, that was caused by a housing bubble. So that one was kind of fundamentally different than what we've seen today. Next slide. So in concluding our work at the task force, we came up with a very long list of recommendations that government needs to do. And I'm just going to speak about some of them here. We clearly need to take the actions at local and regional government that we need to increase construction and preservation of affordable housing. We have formed a regional affordable housing committee. The task force was a one-time thing, and we issued our report and sunset. Now we have a committee that is not only of government, it is 20 members, including government, builders, nonprofits, affordable housing agencies, the housing authorities. It's a wide ranging group of folks. And we're trying to push the local government needle forward. One of the things that I like to say to people is everything in the task force report, all the recommendations that we have, they're all ands, not ors. There's no silver bullet that if you do this one thing and do it really big, you're going to fix the problem. We need to do all of these things. In addition to just increasing construction and preservation, we really need to prioritize transit-oriented development where we can put lots and lots of dense, affordable housing next to the very high quality transit we're providing. That also has been shown to be a key tie to opportunity. People who can live near fast, frequent, reliable transportation, that has been shown to be a really key factor in upward economic mobility. We need to keep renters from losing their homes as much we can, because that just makes the problem bigger. We need to work with communities of color and low income communities so that when we do take like for example in TOD, when we upzone around light rail stations, that we're not just continuing to wholesale displace communities of color and make them move further and further away from jobs and school and all the places they need to be. As I said before, our goal at the Affordable Housing Committee is to build or preserve 44,000 units affordable to people at or below 50% of AMI. We're currently working on analyzing unused and new revenue sources because we know we're going to need to build a lot of subsidized affordable housing. We've made a little bit of progress on that with the House Bill 1406, which was a nice sales tax swap from the state to the locals that can be put to use. We're updating countywide planning policies, which is part of our growth management comprehensive planning that hopefully then rolls down to some zoning changes that will allow for more housing where it is most needed and most possible to build a lot of it. We really need to work with our cities to consider how we can maximize housing at those TOD sites. And a lot of this work is in progress right now. And by the way, cities are doing a variety of different things that help, but we really need this push. Next slide. Was that a time check? Sorry, okay. Post-COVID, we have a serious immediate crisis, but the long-term challenges, as has been said, really continue to exist. We anticipate housing cost burden will rise, further disproportionate impacts on people of color, further evictions and foreclosures, and we need an immediate response. But we really have to look beyond just recovering and living through this time, and we have to sort of try to find a way to springboard into a better future. The federal government's going to have a major role to play here. This shows historically, and here you can see the feds have provided about 75% of the funding for subsidized affordable housing, and they are the primary source for rental subsidies. We should encourage the Senate to take action on the House's HEROES Act, which would provide $100 billion for rental assistance, $11.5 billion for homeless emergency solutions, and a nationwide eviction and foreclosure moratorium. We also need a federal stimulus package that focuses on housing. National investment in housing can kickstart our economy and address a long-standing crisis. Next slide. At the state level, we also need to take action on tax reform. We have the most regressive tax code in the nation. We can no longer really afford to continue raising revenues to help house low-income people by imposing the greatest burden on the very people we're trying to help. Last year, the legislature considered a concrete progressive tax proposal that would have enabled counties to impose tax on the highest earners at our largest companies to pay for homeless services and affordable housing. We made great progress, and businesses, frankly, came to the table first on this proposal. It didn't get over the finish line. We're probably all aware of the activities in Seattle adopting a similar tax that's estimated to raise $200 million in their city. But the need is everywhere, and I really believe that we should revisit that statewide proposal in the next legislative session and continue to think creatively about how we can pay for basic infrastructure like affordable housing throughout King County. So I think that's my last slide. There may be one more, there you go. And I will pause there and just say that this is, I believe, one of the big causes of our time. If we want to make our communities better for people, if we want to have a successful economy, if we want to have the kind of society where we have not got areas that are exclusive and where people are not able to live, in other areas where our workforce largely congregates, which I don't believe is a healthy way to have to organize our region, we need to act now, and we need to act with intentionality, and we need to make sure that we are highlighting race and equity in our work, because we just really struggle to provide the kind of services and infrastructure that all our people need and deserve. I want to thank you all for inviting me today, and I'll stick around for any questions. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you well, thank you first of all to all of our speakers. We really appreciate it. This has been really thought-provoking. We're running a little bit shy on time, but I'm going to try to field 1 or 2 questions, and any of our speakers can take these. So I think one of them has to do more with density and the argument that's happening now with the pandemic about density increasing the spread of disease, and if there's a good answer to that. So we'll have to make these answers really brief, but that's the first one.
Can you say it again?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you respond when when the solution to so many of these problems is transit-oriented development and making more density, but there's been a criticism of that lately with the pandemic that that when you push people together, the disease spreads more readily. So how do you respond to that?
I mean, I'll jump in quickly just on, again, the sort of timeline issue that I had put forth. We know what we know today. And if I put what I know today into the design of a building, that building's not going to show up for 2, 3, 4 years from now. And so certainly, I think there are developers trying to kind of think about what that might mean for the future. But we're still in such an uncertain period of time for how long and how that factors in that I don't, it's tricky. I don't think we're moving back to an all suburban single family home world. It's not that there isn't enough space to do that. So I think that's, we are still continuing to develop and build high density multifamily buildings, and many others are as well. And with great hope that we are going to find solutions that help us as a community around the public health crisis.
I want to just add 2 things. I think that's right on. And one of them is one of the roles that King County plays is we are the public health provider for the county. And so I've been spending a lot of time looking at COVID data and our responses. And some of the early ideas that because COVID hit so hard in some of our denser cities originally, that it was essentially a problem of density, has really been debunked by the later growth of the virus in places that are far more spread out. It's not fundamentally just about density. And secondly, I don't know what option we have. If the idea is that we're suddenly not going to do density anymore, we have to change all our regional plans, I can't even sketch out the beginnings of a sustainable way for this region to grow and succeed if we just decide to not do density anymore. So we have to find a way to make it work.
Great, thank you for that. And so I think just to round things out, and I apologize, there's so many great questions, but if each one of you can just briefly share an actionable thing that people can focus on, because I know that there's a lot happening right now with the US House of Representatives and the Senate. There's a lot happening at the state level. There's so many things with the comp plan. There's just so many things happening. So what's one thing you would highlight for people as they leave? And let's start with you, Claudia. And
okay, yeah. One thing that people can do, we at local government need support from people who will argue in favor of the things that we need to create and preserve more affordable housing. We need to raise revenue, which means taxes. We need to upzone, which means angry neighbors. We need to look at things like, I'm looking in the chat, there's lots of great questions. If we reduce the amount of tax and cost burden that government puts on builders to build, that the costs of government have to come from somewhere else. And there, believe me, lots of really natural opposition to all those things. We need the folks to come out in support of all those things we need to do. So we need email your representatives, organize around, a group like this can organize around letting us know the things that we should do and help us have the courage, the political courage that we need to take the actions we need to take.
Yeah, I'll second that. And the one thing that you can do, folks on the call, right, is I would say continue to support efforts at Olympia around the multifamily property tax exemption, well, obviously on the new construction side, but also recent efforts, particularly to use it for housing preservation. It's one of the sneaky, most effective tools we have as a community that allows us to build housing, to limit sort of the impact on government receipts, but also as a progressive tax related to sort of people who have higher value properties are paying a larger share of that burden. So, so I think it seems like of the things that are low-hanging fruit, I would put that amongst the things that we should focus on.
And then maybe to follow on is just to say, share what you've learned today. Share what you've learned today with 10 other people that you think have a different opinion on density, on the need for housing across economic spectrums, on the type of diversity in housing typologies that we should be delivering, and help move people's minds to this idea that we need housing now. We need to continue to, and that we need to continue to address the housing crisis in parallel with addressing the COVID crisis. They can't be sequential. We can't put this on hold until we've solved the COVID crisis, because we will just, the bucket with the hole in the bottom that Councilmember Balducci mentioned is just gonna get to a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger hole, and it will be traumatic for everybody, so.
Great. Well, thank you all. I wish we had more time, but sadly we are through. So I hope that this was a good use of everybody's time, and I'll be following up shortly with another email. So have a lovely day, everyone, and hope to see you all again in the future. So cheers.